and we're in a store, and a woman comes out and says how beautiful the weather was, and both Jeff and I went, "Da-da," which is wrong, because that's yes, yes in Russian, instead of ya, ya, which we should have said. And when we did that, she blanched, turned around, and walked away from us. And you have to remember, well, Berliners were there when the Russians took over, and it was horrific, especially for women. As you know, she had been probably gang raped as a young girl, by the Russian soldiers. And so PTSD, talk about, oh my God, I felt so bad. You can't fix that. You can't say, we're sorry.
Sorry the Russians were here.
Our first day here, we already screwed up. Very embarrassed. But da in German does mean there. So da drüber, over there, right? So Dasein is Heidegger's invention, because we are being, human being, there. We're here.
So was he? Because I was trying to understand. He seemed like he had kind of a dichotomy between like existence and like presence. Like I exist,
so
but
being,
the table is present.
Being,
right?
Sein, and Zeit, his main work.
Right? Zeit, right?
So being in time, which Sartre plays on that in his response to that book in
Being in Nothingness.
Being in Nothingness, right? L'être et le néant, because Sartre is French, although he studies in Germany. So he studied with Husserl. But Heidegger was like absolutely his interest, along with Husserl, his professor. But Heidegger is trying to get beyond the language, get back to the ancient Greek question of the nature of being. That should be the big question. And when, of course, with Hegel, the answer being in his logic interacts with nothing, nothingness, right? So being immediately causes a reaction with its antithesis, which is the absence of everything. Causes then something to happen, and then you've got evolution, right? So that's his genesis of the universe. Really, is this interrelationship between being and nothing, and Heidegger goes back to this ancient concept of being, as trying to understand it. And even though Hegel gives us the, everything is our conscious awareness, and that's encoded in our language, right? So that's the socially constructed reality, really, or the sociality of reason, as remember Terry Pinkard gives us, right? But Heidegger wants to get beyond that. So he's still trying to get to what Kant called the thing, das Ding an sich, the thing in itself, right? And Schopenhauer called the will, right? And so it's trying to get outside of the limitations of language. And so philosophy becomes poetic, not just literal. So we try to use language then to get in touch with the world, escaping the restrictions that language imposes on our abilities, right? Music, remember Schopenhauer thought music achieved that for us, right? But Heidegger does try to use language. It's odd when Heidegger explains other people in his literature, it's absolutely marvelous, and you feel like you really get it, and you understand what he's describing, and you feel like you understand the philosophers and the thought that he's explaining. That's great. And then he writes his own books, and you're absolutely confused. You can't figure out what the heck is he talking about. Because he's trying to get outside of the limitations of language. Well, can you communicate if you're basically breaking the rules, inventing your own words? Dasein is an invention, right? We are in being. We're there. And that's kind of the existential aspect of his philosophy, because once you're there, then what? What do? Right? You know, you're the one that's creating this world. And if you think about his lifetime, this was pretty darn serious stuff, because he ends up becoming a supporter of Hitler. We know what he was thinking was that Hitler was ein Dummkopf, nur ein Schwein, just a stupid moron. And he, being the genius that he was going to get into the party and become the real leader and direct the Nazis to being good for humanity, good for German kind, etc. But within less than a year, well, it was pretty fast. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years, he realized his mistake, that there was no controlling Hitler. Sorry, I'm thinking Steve Bannon, you know.
Right.
Sorry. Not sorry. You know, but, you know, history repeats itself. It doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Right. Yeah.
That's, you know.
Well, I don't know, man.
Who said that? I forget.
If you have a completely...
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It seems like the GOP's got a pretty... They've got a better PR setup, because, I mean, like, the Democrats are kind of running on, like, a fuzzy future that nobody's seen. And the GOP's got all these nice black and white photos to show everybody what it's trying to achieve. So, feels like an advertising advantage.
Twain said.
What was his real name?
Samuel Clemens.
Samuel Clemens.
Yeah.
Mark Twain.
He was a Hegel.
Twain is 2 lengths of the rope. That was how it was on steamboats in the river, and they have to constantly check the depth, and so the rope would have like a length and then 2 lengths, and so if the guy yelled Mark Twain, you know, so log down
Mark the depth.
2.
Yeah.
Twain would be 2. You know, so Mark Twain was like a depth of how deep the water was at 2.
Joe Steele.
Yeah, that's. But everyone thinks of him as Mark Twain. The Mark Twain Awards. So the problem, of course, is now he's trying to control Hitler. Sorry about the Trump slip. But by the way, just to throw this in there, there's a book by Michael, what's his name? I'm not going to be able to think of the book. He wrote Moneyball. That's another one I read of his. I'll use this to go and find
Michael Lewis.
Michael Lewis. Okay, so Michael Lewis, The Fifth Risk. So the cover of this book says, what happens if the people that get elected into the government don't know what the government does? And so...
It happens all the time.
Well, because every 4 years or 8 years we have a change in administration, and
So you're just talking about like a complete breakdown in continuity?
Well, so, for example, at the Department of Energy,
Yeah. In
it
charge
takes
of all the
years
nuclear
for you
bombs.
to learn what the Department of Energy does, because it does so many odd things that have
They have all the
gradually-
bombs.
They have all the bombs.
Nobody knows that.
All sorts of, plus weather and so on.
Yeah.
Well, Trump's pick for the head of the Department of Energy once said that he was going to try to get rid of the Department of Energy as one of his campaign goals,
It's like,
because he thought they were all evil, too much government, all they,
yeah.
do is believe in global warming and all that stuff. But no, it turns out that they have like the teams that make sure that sports events don't have terrorists with nuclear bombs.
And that, yeah, they're also in charge of all the nuclear
They're in charge of all the loose uranium that's all over the world to try to keep track of it so the terrorists can't get it first. It turns out there's like,
heating
it would take you
oil, stabilization funds, and all kinds of stuff.
yeah, it's like a multi.
That's just one department.
Yeah, that's just one department. And normally, like Obama had sent 50 knowledgeable experts to take, the place of the people that were going to be leaving. And Bush had done pretty much the same thing, and they had everybody had their transition packets ready to explain to their replacements what the job would be, so that they would be ready for it. And the day arrived, and nobody showed up. And the next day, nobody showed up. And the next day, nobody showed up. And they were thinking, are they going to call us? Finally, after about a month, the guy who was picked to be the head of it showed up and said, well, you should come in and start getting, trained up in all this. And he said, well, actually, I can't come back until after Thanksgiving, which was like a month later. And so no one was coming in to learn stuff. And meanwhile, the ones that are there start to leave, because, well, they're out of there, so no one's coming in to replace their jobs, and stuff.
It's like the State
And
Department. It's
finally,
pretty hollow still.
and so Chris Christie was the one that had convinced Trump that he needed a transition team and he ought to have, people getting ready for it and everything. And Trump said to him, you and I are smart enough that within an hour of me being president, we can do a transition.
Doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
They need to find at least like 4,000 people to fill jobs that are important jobs.
Just the classified briefs will take weeks.
Yeah, and plus they need their clearances.
Uh-huh.
So like the people he sent to the Department of Energy couldn't listen to the briefings because they didn't have clearances.
Yeah. You're talking about an entire infrastructure of a country. Not just the
But the
nuclear
reason I
side.
brought this up was because Steve Bannon is kind of the philosopher involved,
Oh, yeah.
and he's the one that
He
that
thought he was going to be
basically
in charge, and he got kicked out in the first. He was in the
and-
first purge.
Yeah, so that's kind of like, Bannon is to Trump like Heidegger
Heidegger's
was
Hitler.
to Hitler. That's why I brought that up.
Isn't that usually how it works, though?
And
Is
that's
there's
maybe that's wrong to do,
a witch doctor to the thug.
but the controversy though is Heidegger did fire some Jewish professors, including Husserl, who was like his mentor as well as Sartre's. Husserl Phenomenology. He's actually in our book, and I have him on the syllabus after the people that he influenced. So that was dumb. I should have reversed that. Should have done Husserl first. And he's a phenomenologist, so he's how to study the phenomena without influencing your study of it by your perspective, which today we would simply say, nice try, but you can't do that. Your perspective is definitely going to filter the way you see things, which is our current perspective, which is why we can't see otherwise.
But under not Not having someone trained and come into a new high important job like that. That's why even in the military.
Go
you
take a
have
look at his book, because
a person in a position like that, there's a period in which those two get together, the outgoing guy and the incoming guy or gal.
the incoming
Have-
guy thought his main job was to fire everybody
Yeah,
and get rid of it without knowing what it did.
yeah.
And then once you discover that it's like, somebody's got to do this.
Yeah, that's you know.
You
the
can't just
entire
fire everybody.
Power grid of the entire
You actually have to
country,
know stuff.
You know,
You're not actually qualified to do this. You don't understand what you're talking about. The people that are here are like PhDs in physics.
yeah, and they've been doing the job.
Yes, it
Thank
took them
you.
years to learn it.
There never was a Department
So-
of Energy. What you're talking about? Obama conspiracy.
Well, just so I don't know that Hitler was similar in those respects. Which books do you read about Hitler? There are new books about Hitler. The one I was most influenced in years ago was Joachim C. Fest's Hitler, which is still out there. Although Joachim Fest has written lots more stuff since. That was one of his younger books. For some reason, it seems difficult to keep up with all of these elements of this large conversation, which you feel obligated to.
I see more similarities with Trump and Stalin than Hitler anyway.
Oh, I didn't see the movie, but I did.
You have to check that out.
I did watch the
The trailer.
the trailer and realized I had seen this before, not the movie, but the trailer. And I did follow up on outtakes or other scenes that apparently didn't make it into the
Deleted scenes
movie.
and stuff.
So even though I didn't see the movie, I saw the scenes that basically indicate that the whole thing is a failed state, full of people that don't know what they're doing.
It was really clumsy. Like,
Yeah,
the whole
well,
thing.
but I knew that already because Yeltsin, Boris.
It's just, I think they did a really good job. Yeah, right? Boris Yeltsin. Khrushchev.
Oh my God, yeah, Brezhnev Gavarit.
No, none of those guys are like
I
nearly
bought
as
books
competent as.
in East Berlin.
But just how much of the regime. Same with
Had
the
them
Nazis.
in my apartment when I was being packed up to go to the NSA. The MPs came to check to make sure that everything that I was packing to send to the U.S. was legal. And they came in and they saw these books in Russian and they said, none of these communist books say anything bad about the U.S., do they? And I looked at them and said, oh, no.
Of course not.
They didn't speak Russian, so they had no clue. So of course, I still have them. So the government shipped them for me, even though, strictly speaking,
No, I was going to say.
Lenin,
it's,
Brezhnev, they were cheap. And I thought that would help my Russian.
Right? It's just like
By
how
the way,
much of the
the
Hollywood
amount of
effect
Russian I
is-
learned in order to do that job was overkill, actually.
Yeah, it ends up being over.
In a way, the same thing applies to this. Generally speaking, what we should be doing is going over the text that I assigned and talking about it to make sure that you understand what's going on there. Instead, I generally assume that you've read all the texts and you're more interested in kind of discursive sorts of aspects of what I think.
Well, that's how we can find out if we understand the idea as applied in reality, not just the text.
But the thing is, it's all that weird stuff that is more interesting to me now,
Got it, yeah.
right? So when I go reading stuff to refresh my memory about what we're talking about, I read stuff that I'm not going to bring up, really, because, well, what is Dasein, right?
Right.
That's the important part here, right? And for Sartre, who's responding to Heidegger, and I really should kind of finish up the relationship that Heidegger had to the Nazis and Jewish anti-Semitism, because apart from firing Husserl and others as the head of the third arm of the Reich, which Heidegger called it, so the first arm is der Wehrmacht, the military, the army. The second arm is der Luftwaffe, right, the Air Force. And then Heidegger says, and the third arm is the academics.
Not the Kriegsmarine.
No, the academics were the third arm.
They didn't do so well.
And because we academics are going to train the minds, the young minds of the Übermenschen.
Yeah, it's like the North
etc.
Korean
So-
intellectuals.
So
The
Heidegger
before
thought,
or
at
after
least,
the third
when he
books?
first became the head academic, that he would help prune the Jewish faculty away, even though they were the ones that made it possible for him to be in his position. No thankfulness, so that's a horrendous activity for someone, no gratitude to his mentors. But also, one of his students, famously, Hannah Arendt. Have you ever heard of her?
Who?
Hannah Arendt?
I think so.
She was famous. So she was one of his students and grad students, and lover. And she was also Jewish. Go figure. And by the way, Mrs. Heidegger, Frau Heidegger, knows about his lover. And in fact, there's pictures of the three of them smiling with one another. In other words, not only is she aware that Heidegger is making love with his student, but they have a relationship. The only thing Mrs. Heidegger did not like about Hannah was that she smoked. She was a constant smoker, and she didn't like that. But so, interesting aspects of this. Hannah is a philosopher on her own. She ends up, by the way, marrying this. This is just weird. Okay, so who is Frau Blucher? Who is Frau Blucher? What nice knockers.
I am Paul Blucher.
Inga, may I present Frau Blucher? After you, Frau Blucher. Blucher! Good night, Frau Blucher. A toast. Toast to Blucher. Cigars.
So who is Frau Blucher? Hannah Arendt is Frau Blucher because she marries a guy named Blucher, and the two of them have their grave at Bard College. Hannah Arendt Blucher. Is that the joke that Mel Brooks is making, because Mel Brooks is Jewish, in case you didn't know. I just thought I'd make sure you knew, right? It's clear. And sorry, my accent is more Eastern European than Jewish. I don't know. Didn't plan that. It just kind of happened. So I think, because the Jewish community does not like Hannah Arendt. Why? Because it's a terrible word for what? Do something. Go on. Go. Oh. What happened? Why? Okay. So, notice the author of this book is Hannah Arendt, and Eichmann was one of the guards at the. Is actually no, not a guard. He was the man Hitler put in charge of the final solution, which is the Holocaust. Right? He's the man in charge of it. And he had escaped the collapse of the Third Reich. I think he was in Brazil, but the Israelis found him, brought him back to Jerusalem, put him on trial, and Hannah Arendt was an American newspaper reporter reporting on the trial. And this is the book that she writes about it, where she coins the phrase, the banality of evil, by basically concluding that he's not an evil person. He's just like you and I, and he was just doing his job, which just happened to be killing all the Jews in Europe. So the Jewish community was absolutely furious, as my daughter says, furious with her. What kind of a Jewess are you? A Jewish princess. You know that. Actually, remember Mel Brooks in Spaceballs has Druidia. She's a Jewish princess with a great big hair dryer. I just love it. But in any case, so Hannah Arendt, and by the way, that's a long-term relationship, because she comes back to visit when they're in Switzerland and things of that sort. So that's pretty darn interesting. So it makes him an enigma. How on earth can he be a member of the Nazi establishment, does his part for the Nazi sweep of the institutions that he's in charge of, although he only did it for like a year and a half or so, and then he fled himself to his cabin in Toten am Berg, or whatever. Let's see if I can find Heidegger. How do you say that? Here's his cabin. No, that's not the cabin. Why? Oh. So you could visit this. It's a tourist. You have to walk up the mountain, though.
It's a great corn groove
Looks
music
like-
for this.
What is this?
What's about to go down in that house?
What terrible music. But that's the house. That's where he wrote
Wow.
lots of his stuff. What?
Check out that view.
Yeah.
So that's
Although
the very-
Tod means death. Tod na Berg, death on the mountain. That's Mrs. Heidegger. Frau Heidegger.
This is definitely
This is a weird video.
70s.
70s?
Is this an adult film music?
I'm not familiar with those sort of things themselves.
Der Umgang mit Freunden. Hier ein Amateurfilm, aufgenommen im Garten des Hauses auf dem Rötebuck in Freiburg.
So
Die Bilder
this
lassen
is the
etwas
house in
über
Freiburg.
Zuneigung,
That's a different
Güte
house.
und Anteilnahme verspüren, deren der Mensch Heidegger fähig ist. Sie verraten zugleich etwas von seiner Scheu vor dem Trubel und von seiner Empfindsamkeit für
By
das
the
Wort.
way,
Man hat Heidegger als Denkwebel verspottet, als alemannische Zipfelmütze.
and
Ernstzunehmende Kritiker werfen ihm Unbrauchbarkeit und Unverwertbarkeit seines Denkens im Blick auf die Gesellschaft,
one of
die
his students,
offene
so a
und
lot
die
of the
Einheitsgesellschaft
famous
vor.
German philosophers today
Wo
were students of
Brauchbarkeit
his.
und Zweckdienlichkeit die Kriterien setzen, wo der Verstand nur rechnet, schrumpft das Denken. Man misst Heidegger mit Maßen, die man selbst gesetzt hat. Heidegger macht niemandem das Geschäft streitig. Man sollte seinen Beruf nicht unterschätzen. Mag bei ihm der Verstand zu kurz kommen. Vernunft kommt durch ihn
Probably
zu
getting
Besinnung.
this Stalin stuff because you suggested that movie and I watched it. So I'm getting weird stuff there. Okay, well, but so you get the idea. It's, you know, you can take a walk up and see his place. His son has a video on here where he explains this is where my dad wrote his work, looking out the window at the little fountain. You know, there's like a little, they showed it briefly. It's like, it looks almost like a sliding board, but it's water running down from the tap, which is running all the time because there's a spring there. Okay, so Heidegger. He lived to like the 60s. He was in, after the war was over, he was imprisoned for, was he imprisoned or just made to stay up at his cabin? I forget. One way or the other. He was out of teaching for a while, but then he was allowed to go back and teach. And so he was a professor. They're still trying to figure out Nazi or not a Nazi, you know, and so does his being associated with the Nazis mean we really shouldn't study his philosophy? But that doesn't work because he's an important philosopher, so you've got to study his philosophy. But does studying his philosophy lead you to become a Nazi? Well, the same problem, of course, happened with Nietzsche, you know, as the Übermensch idea, you know, guilty of you know, the Nazi using the Übermensch as a part of their philosophical point of view. By the way, I haven't heard Trump basically talking about a Übermensch at all. I don't think he's read any of that stuff. It's all too long.
Yeah.
However, so what about Sartre's response, and who is Sartre? Sartre, unless you have questions on, I'm very conscious of how fast time is moving here. And so Sartre, notice, younger. So while Heidegger dies in the 60s, I should have double-checked that, but Sartre is younger. His book is a response to Heidegger. By the way, Heidegger wrote lots more stuff besides Sein und Zeit. The Sein und Zeit was like his graduate thesis, main book kind of thing. And very difficult, but nonetheless, part of this European movement to what British and American analytic philosophers would say totally misusing language, right? Where they, they're, it's nonsense, it's not real serious philosophy. Of course, the Europeans all think it is, and That's why Zizek is kind of, well, Noam Chomsky, you know, I understand him, but he doesn't understand me. And that's, you know, so in that sense, it's pretty clear that even though it's a different kind of language, a different way that you use language, it's maybe poetic, as Heidegger says, as opposed to the kind of thing you could translate into computer code and run a program with. I mean, what Bina is running on, I'm sure, is not poetry, right? You have to type in code that a computer can just do, right? Whereas poetry, you're like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And Bina can't on ambiguous code, it's just, no, can't do that. So the British and the American analytic traditions creating language that can eventually then become computer code, and there's the association then with science that if your statements are ambiguous, then we don't know how to test them to see if they're true or false, right? But for the Europeans, the whole concept of truth, what does that mean? It can mean lots of different things in lots of different contexts, of course. And so it definitely seems like the Europeans are trying to get in touch with something that's beyond what American and British analytic philosophers were trying to do. And remember, I think I mentioned Brian McGee and how he himself was very disappointed in that British tradition as a student, what he learned, and then, the reason he wasn't, I mentioned him, right? I talked about Brian McGee. You guys? Ooh, maybe not. So let me do Brian McGee real quick, because he's still alive. So, and this is him. He was like the BBC.
Which made up science was simply true. Now, there came, didn't there, a period in the development of science, beginning in the late 19th century, when people began to realize that these statements were not entirely true, that this wasn't just a body of objective fact which had been read off from the world. In other words, that science was corrigible. Scientific theories could be wrong. And that raises some very profound questions. If science isn't just an objective description of the way things are, what is it? And if we don't get it from observing the world, where do we get it from?
Was at Harvard with
Well, I don't want to say we don't get it from observing the world at all. Obviously, part of this Kantian image is that there is a contribution which is not us, there's something out there, but that also there's a contribution from us. Even Kant, by the way, thought that Newtonian science was indubitable, but he thought we contributed its indubitability. The step beyond Kant is...
So Brian McGee, so he studied philosophy, got his degree in the Oxford University, studied with a lot of the important Wittgenstein followers there, but was very frustrated because he got involved in philosophy because of the questions he experienced as a youth, the big picture questions. When he got there, he realized that they weren't addressing them at all, because they were dealing with the nature of language and how to create statements that were clear, and doing mathematical logic type things with those, right? And that's, by the way, a lot of Americans I know were very bored by that whole process and would not study philosophy because they didn't like that. But the thing is, by the time I was in philosophy, we're really looking into the 70s now. So I went to school in 69, became a philosophy major in 70, and so from 70 to 77 when I joined the Army. I'm studying all sorts of philosophy, and I obviously get Wittgenstein and Quine and Hilary Putnam and Russell and logic, but I also get Dr. Rayukas with Hegel and Kant and Fichte and Schelling and Sartre and etc. Right, so I get the European traditions too. So I lucked out, maybe by just a couple of years. Nietzsche became a significant study in the U.S. in the University of Texas, Austin, Texas, I guess. Became kind of a hotbed of Nietzsche philosophy in the mid-60s. Before that, Nietzsche was thought of as kind of just an oddball literary person. Same as Kierkegaard, by the way. Kierkegaard was not, and Camus. They're literature, not philosophy. Philosophy is to be the value of a variable, of a bound variable, right? So Quinian, Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, that was philosophy in the American tradition. But Brian McGee, though, this guy, went to Yale, and when he got to Yale, it was like all the things he really wanted philosophy to be. So he loved going to Yale. But then when he goes back and he actually ends up teaching for a while, he realizes he's stuck having to teach the very things that he hates, and so he doesn't like that, so he gets out of it after a while and gets back into TV and doing all these kinds of things on the TV, which made philosophy available to the common people and explained a lot. So Brian McGee, pretty interesting. Not a philosopher in the sense that he's got all his own great ideas. He helps communicate stuff about the philosophers that are out there, right? The history of philosophy and stuff. Very fond of Schopenhauer. I thought I might have mentioned him while we were talking about Schopenhauer, because he's one of the ones who writes a biography of Schopenhauer. I think I mentioned the one by Rudy Safransky, which is the new one. By the way, Rudy Safransky also writes a biography of Heidegger, which I read. Very good, very good. And he also did Goethe, and then who was the fourth? Gosh, I always have trouble. Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the fourth one. So Rudy was interesting. Okay, Jean-Paul Sartre. So, odd health problems, especially his eyes. He had eye problems. Maybe that's why he became a nerd. Did a lot of reading, studied a lot, ended up becoming a teacher. Of course, it was kind of interrupted by World War II, the Nazi occupation of France. For a while, he was in prison because he was a member of the military fighting and got captured.
Wait, Sartre was in the military?
Yes.
Is that where his eye got messed up?
No, his eye was messed up from birth.
Okay. I can never tell which one's his good eye.
No, I don't want to figure that out. They know, I'm sure. But so he became like the star writer in France as the Americans come in and kick the Nazis out. And everybody's depressed, and France is in near ruins. Not nearly as bad as Germany, I guess. In fact, a lot of the French actually thought that the German occupiers did a better job running France than the French. So the Vichy...
Yeah, I mean, Vichy isn't that, like, they seem to have some popular support.
Right, so...
Field Marshal Pétain.
yeah, they were more efficient in some ways, and the Germans respected. From what I understand, the Germans, they took a lot of stuff, but for the most part, they respected the high culture of the French and the women. So the Germans were cultured people. The Russians were not. So when the Russian army came into Germany and other places, they were a horde of rapists, etc. But the Germans were a civilized occupying force. They were occupying them, but they didn't destroy.
Well, the Russians kind of
They
looted
came
everything
in and Hitler posed for pictures
in front
at
of
the
them.
Eiffel Tower,
Yeah.
right? So that's, they didn't bomb it or anything, right? They were proud that they were there, basically. By the way, Hitler really wanted to be allies with England. It was Churchill that insisted that they were not going to become a member of the Axis nations, because they were in competition with one another. Churchill wanted to be more of the empire builder than Hitler. Well, I mean, they were in competition, right? So, did I mention the book, The Taste of War?
Mm-mm.
That's a fascinating book. But once you read it, you don't think about the Second World War the same.
The Germans didn't really seem to want to fight Britain or France. It seemed like that was more their necessity. It seemed like they really wanted to just go after the Soviet Union the whole time. Just
They
take
wanted
their
Lebensraum.
Eastern European junk, and we have to fight France to get it. But that's what we're really.
They
after.
wanted Lebensraum, living room,
Yeah.
not a living room.
Oh, you did talk about this one, the food battle.
Yeah, because
Well,
Hitler
what
was
did the
informed
Nazis
that we're going
know?
to starve to death thanks to Churchill's.
Well, what did the Nazis know about like the Holodomor and stuff like that? Like the Ukrainian famines and stuff in the 30s? Because there wasn't any food in there when they got there.
Oh, there was.
Was there?
The farmers knew how to hide it from them.
But they didn't hide.
But
they
once
weren't
the
able to hide it from
Russians
the
kicked the
Russians.
Germans out,
Yeah.
the Germans knew how to search better
Oh, okay.
than the Germans did. Maybe they were harsher. They killed the farmers.
Oh, I'm sure the Russians were really excited
The-
about all those
The
Ukrainians.
Germans
that
thought,
didn't-
the farmers feed us, so we protect the farmers, but we need the food, so please give us the food. And they're like, well, don't have any. And they didn't go check where they might have hidden it, right? At least, I don't. But the Russians came in, killed the kulaks, and took everything they could find. Because Stalin's priorities were different. Stalin's priorities were the military, the industry that made it possible for the military to fight, and then the food. The
Because
farmers,
Germany never
right?
really got put on a war footing. Like I think the Nazis tried everything to keep them on like a regular
Right,
civilian
right.
economy.
Right, pretty famous for doing it, But so it's as usual. There's lots of political emphasis on how to interpret things like World War II, Hitler, and so on.
Yeah.
If you think about it, to the Germans, Hitler was their guy, their hero. There's still, I'm sure, a lot of Germans that feel that way. Of course, because they lost.
There's some romanticism in a lost cause. The South and the Civil War.
Norway. Norway was more pro-Nazi than they want anyone to realize.
Well, they didn't have a hard time taking them over.
Yeah.
Like, it seemed like they got a lot of cooperation.
It still is, actually, as far as I understand it. However, so France, of course, is taken over. He's in prison. Even while in prison, though, he writes. and his play was performed. And the play that he wrote, The Frogs, I think, was a satire on the Nazi occupying force, and the Nazi censors approved it to be performed, which tells me that they understood what it was about and that it was satirizing their own occupation, but thought it was funny and interesting. So you know, but once the war is over, France is very depressed, and you end up then with Sartre becoming like the writer that everybody really liked. And he became really, really popular. I don't know if I can find the video that.
Jean-Paul Sartre, where's Ricky? You make your life the way you want it. And for them to sit down and work out in great detail, they actually have sort of essentially a contract that they worked out.
I wish I could find like the stuff that I've already watched. I should have saved it somehow. Because there's a really great No Exit, BBC, that's it. Yep, this is it.
He developed a strong interest in phenomenology, a new branch of philosophy that offered a radical account of the factors of human consciousness. In 1933, he took a year off and went to Berlin to study under Edmund Husserl, the world's leader in that field. When Sartre returned to Paris, he felt he had found an entirely new way of seeing man's existence in the world.
The big idea he got was that to be conscious of something is to relate to an item in the world rather than to relate to some inner representation of it within your head. What we think of as self-consciousness is actually our consciousness of the world. The idea that we have such a thing as a self, an inner character, an essential being that we truly are, that is a myth according to Sartre. And it's the whole kind of moral impulse of his work is to try and get people to abandon the idea, to give up. So actually, in some ways rather comforting, security blanket of an idea that there is some answer, some inner answer to the question who we are. Sartre's whole argument is that there is no predetermined character which makes you be who you are. Who you are is a function of what you do.
That's why I wore this shirt.
Sartre loved
Demonstrating
cinema,
my freedom of
especially
choice.
thrillers, and went most evenings. He was struck by the difference between the characters on the screen and the people on the streets outside the cinema. The people outside could do anything they liked because they were making it up as they went along. Unlike in the films he saw, there was no preordained script in real life. Inspired by Husserl and his cinema experience, Sartre began writing an essay on what he called the contingency of existence, the fact that we seem to be here by chance with no purpose in life. Simone de Beauvoir, who was now his lover, suggested he rewrite it as a thriller. The result was a novel published in 1939,
La Noce.
which gave a name to existential angst, nausea.
Here we all are, all of us, eating and drinking to preserve our precious existence. And there's nothing, absolutely no reason for existing.
I remember my philosophy teachers in French lycée, they were flabbergasted by Sartre, because generally, philosophers talk about the lamp on their table. When I perceive the lamp on my
British
table, what do I
analyst.
see? Now here was Sartre saying, I am in a cafe, and I want to know what the essence of the waiter is. That was very new.
Cast in the form of a fictional diary in which the central character, Roquefort, discovers the
Totally different kinds of
universe,
language about.
Nausea was an entirely original piece of writing which immediately became widely read. It translated complicated philosophical ideas into familiar everyday images. At its heart was an encounter with a tree, during the course of which Roquentin comes face to face with what he calls the key to existence.
Then all of a sudden, there it was.
This is the highlight of the book.
Existence had lost the inoffensive aspect of an abstract category.
And
it was the
pukes
actual
on
glue
the tree.
of things. This root was molded in existence. I realized that I'd found the key to existence, the key to my nausea, to my whole life. I'd experienced the absolute or the absurd. In front of this great, rugged paw, neither ignorance nor knowledge mattered.
Le fait que la vie n'ait pas de sens, justement, nous donne la possibilité de lui donner un sens. C'est justement parce qu'elle n'en a pas,
South Sea Rooster
écrit d'avance, tout écrit d'avance, que
Take the
autrement dit, on a
subtitles
justifié
off
par
because
rien.
it was taking his French and making gobbledygook out
Nous
of
sommes
it.
contingents,
And you couldn't
par
see
hasard,
that.
notre existence n'obéit à aucune raison. C'est à nous de lui trouver des raisons, en quelque sorte, de lui donner un sens.
When war broke out, Sartre was conscripted into the army and assigned to a meteorological unit, charting wind conditions to direct artillery fire. Operating well away from the front line, he found that he had a surprising amount of free time on his hands.
Sartre would have a lot of guard duty and he would send balloons up in the air with very philosophical gesture and wait to see which way they drifted. And he had what he did not possess in unlimited quantity when he was a teacher, that is time. And there he could reflect on himself and also reflect on the world.
In this somewhat unreal situation, Sartre thought and wrote intensively. He worked on a fictional trilogy, The Roads to Freedom, and began the major philosophical work of his life, Being and Nothingness. It was heavily influenced by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who by a strange coincidence had worked as a meteorologist in the First World War.
Peter and Keller went off to get hydrogen. It was their turn. I reread Heidegger's lecture, What is Metaphysics? And I spent the day staking out a position vis-à-vis his. The philosophy I'm writing is personal. It plays a role in my life, protecting me against the melancholy gloom and sadness of war. Philosophy and life have really become one.
This is so well done, you think, why on earth should I pay him?
When France fell, Sartre was captured and imprisoned. His year as a prisoner of war made him question for the first time the extreme individualism of his thinking.
Là, il fait l'expérience, enfin, qui est tout à fait étonnante, visiblement pour lui, d'une rencontre avec des gens qui sont jetés là, par la guerre, abandonnés dans un coin, enfin, dans un stalag, dans un camp de prisonniers, mais qui viennent de tout horizon. Là, il fait une expérience humaine qui est décisive, qui lui fait prendre conscience de la nécessité de raccorder, de faire un lien entre la liberté individuelle et le groupe, le social.
When Sartre escaped from the prison camp and returned to occupied Paris, he was determined to take part in some kind of resistance. He would have liked to become a man of action. Instead, he threw himself into the most powerful subversive activity he could engage in, his writing.
Il est rentré, c'était en mars 41. Et le changement, je ne reconnaissais pas. Il était d'une moralité. Ça a changé, en fait, heureusement. Mais je parle de morale. Jamais je n'ai entendu parler de ça.
Sartre worked simultaneously on the political play, the novels, and his philosophical writings. He wrote fast. His ideas had been well prepared during his imprisonment. His play, The Flies, a reworking of Greek myth and staged in 1942, was a thinly disguised attack on the collaborationist Vichy government for preaching guilt and submissiveness to the downcast French.
That was the one
Once
that was
freedom explodes in the
passed by
human
the
soul,
censors.
God
the
can
Nazis.
do nothing against man. God can do nothing against this pillar of granite, against this irresistible column, man's freedom.
In an explosion of work, Sartre completed Being and Nothingness in the next year. It was a brilliantly original synthesis of ideas from Heidegger, which became the core of existentialism. At its heart was the concept of authenticity, the idea that individuals can always choose their own actions, even in situations that appear to enslave them.
On avait encore ce choix, même dans la situation la plus dramatique, plus que dramatique, la plus tragique, il y a toujours la possibilité ou de baisser les bras, ou de se laisser aller, ou au contraire peut-être de mourir debout. Il y a toujours une part de choix, même face à l'inéluctable, dans la façon de mourir, par exemple. Sartre était convaincu de ça.
Mathieu was still firing when the roof fell on top of him. He dropped his rifle and fell. 15 minutes, he thought in fury. I'd give anything just to hold on for 15 minutes. Christ, he said aloud. No one shall say we didn't hold out 15 minutes. He fired. He was cleansed. He was all-powerful. He was free.
Here is the news read by Richard Weston. Paris has been liberated. A communique just received from General Koenig announces that it has been liberated by French forces of the interior.
We didn't want to see the French, you see. Because the French...
12:45, so I don't know.
We wanted to see the English and the Americans, and we came along the same. So
That's
we went past the
one of his lovers. I needed a good quiz question, and I didn't
to
give
see
you one.
them, to see the tanks.
What's a good
and
quiz
we hated
question?
tanks and we hated guns. But
Was
to see
Sartre
them
authentic?
coming along the
Was Sartre
side
authentic?
and saying
I don't think
hello.
it's disgusting.
Only
Sartre
hello, you
authentic.
see? Hearing that language that wasn't French anymore, it was beautiful. Everything was going to change.
YouTube is just,
Very cool.
it is. You could get a great education just, looking around and finding all that stuff. But they do a terrific job explaining all that stuff.